When people talk about Hurricane Katrina, they talk about the wind, the heat, the water, the levees, the Superdome, the Ninth Ward. But it wasn't just water that devastated the community. Though a wall of water did in fact wash away entire blocks of homes, it was everything that followed too. When Hurricane Katrina struck the Gulf Coast on August 29, 2005, it exposed the broken systems beneath the surface of American life. It changed the world, not only through the scale and cost of its destruction, but by forcing the questions, what does recovery mean? And who gets to move on?
I talked to a lot of people about Hurricane Katrina, and they know about Hurricane Katrina, but very few people understand Hurricane Katrina, the level of devastation. It wasn't one disaster. It was a natural disaster caused by man-made errors that eventually turned into a political disaster, an education disaster, economic disaster. When you realize that 93 million square miles was impacted, the area impact in the city of New Orleans was 7.5 times the size of Manhattan, 200,000 houses destroyed, hundreds of thousands of people displaced. And for the last 20 years, people have died trying to reclaim their lives and get their lives back together, and people are still struggling.
The day before the storm, mandatory evacuation orders were issued for the first time in New Orleans history. But not everyone had cars, and traffic was already snarled. The Superdome had been opened as an emergency shelter. By the time Hurricane Katrina made landfall in New Orleans at 8 a.m. on August 29th as a Category 3 storm, with winds of 135 miles per hour causing storm surge up to 17 feet in some areas, 25,000 people were taking refuge in the Superdome. The levee system designed to protect the city failed fast. Within 14 minutes, breaches were reported. By 2 p.m., thousands were trapped in their homes by the rising waters. The next day, the water was still rising. Overwhelmed police, fire, and rescue personnel called on private citizens with boats to save people trapped on roofs and in attics. By August 31st, the Superdome was cut off and out of food, water, and power. The bathrooms had failed. Days of garbage piled up in 90-degree heat. Meanwhile, FEMA turned away critical supplies and medical staff. Amtrak and airlines offered to help with transit, and their offers were rejected in the bureaucratic chaos. On September 2nd, the federal government approved one of the first multi-billion-dollar aid packages for rescue and relief. By then, there were bodies in the streets. By September 5th, the U.S. Army Corps had repaired some levee breaches. The city was still 60% underwater on September 6th. Pumps ran nonstop, draining 380,000 cubic liters every second. All told, 250 billion gallons of water were removed, nearly as much water as the entire population of the U.S. uses in a day. The hurricane cut the population of New Orleans in half. In Louisiana, nearly 1,200 people died, and more than 650,000 were displaced. Damage extended to Florida, Mississippi, and Alabama too, where hundreds more died and millions more were left homeless. The conversation and the rebuilding continues, even though scientists have found that people typically only remember the impact of a hurricane for 7 years. But forgetting isn't an option in New Orleans, where half the city sits below sea level. For many, the storm never ended.
We're not really recovering from a hurricane. There have been Category 5 hurricanes since Katrina, and the damage from them has been significantly less. It isn't necessarily about a natural disaster. If you refer to it as a natural disaster here, people will correct you quickly, and they're not wrong to do that. Lower Ninth Ward of New Orleans is a 2-square-mile area that is completely separated from the rest of the city geographically by a body of water called the Inner Harbor Navigation Canal. Colloquially, it's referred to as the Industrial Canal, but it completely separates this neighborhood from all of the rest of the city. When Hurricane Katrina passed over the city of New Orleans, it caused over 50 individual levee breaches around the city, and the most catastrophic of those was on the Industrial Canal, coming into the lower Ninth Ward, every property here, 100% of the homes here were rendered uninhabitable as a result of that levee breach. 80% of the city of New Orleans flooded, but the flooding, the loss of life, the property damage, and so forth were more keenly felt in the lower Ninth Ward than any other section of the city. This was a low-wealth Black neighborhood prior to Katrina. We had a 98.1% Black community. Over 40% of our population lived below the poverty line. More than 60% lived below the average mean income. It was a working-class Black neighborhood, but we enjoyed one of the highest rates of Black home ownership in the nation prior to Katrina. Sadly, the effects of that storm and the results of some recovery programs that were put in place have decimated that Black home ownership rate.
In fact, the main recovery program that was developed in response to Hurricane Katrina, the Road Home, was eventually ruled as discriminatory in federal court.
So in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, Rita, the Louisiana Recovery Authority was charged with putting together the largest home rebuilding recovery program in this nation's history. And we had to come up with ways of distributing these federal dollars to people that we thought would be equitable. We wanted to make sure that everyone had a right to come home, but also had the ability to rebuild. And at the end of the day, part of the regulations put on us by the federal government was that we had to consider the pre-storm value of homes. The problem with considering the pre-storm values of homes was that pre-Katrina, a comparable home in the Black community was valued lower than the same home in the white community. It goes all the way back to the 1950s and 60s, starting with redlining. There are research now that's showing the same appraisal bias process still exists in this country. So if we were going to use the pre-storm value of homes, we had already baked in a bias that was coming from the appraisal of those homes pre-Katrina. And what the research has shown since then, which was very disheartening, was that the people who needed the most money eventually had the greatest need after they got their grant from the federal government.
I applied for my grant the same day it became available on the web. It has been 9 months since I started this process, and I'm still waiting. I attended the required interview. I had all the documentation. I was displaced 3 times, and it was dealing with the situation from afar, but I did my part.
Katrina is still the costliest hurricane in United States history, with actual storm damage valued at more than $200 billion. And that number doesn't even include related economic fallout, like job losses and industry interruptions, problems that continued for years. But with the rate and severity of disasters increasing due to climate change, 9 out of the 10 costliest hurricanes to ever hit the U.S. have happened in the last 2 decades.
There is a start date and there's an end date. The hurricane will come, we have a sense when that happens, it impacts communities, and then it's gone. And then there's the cleanup. The problem with that is that the end date is always different for different groups. And we know that groups that are low-income communities, communities of color, communities where English is not their first language, just because the hurricane is gone doesn't mean that there aren't residual effects after it.
First response disaster recovery tends to be relatively well taken care of. And national and international attention pivots to a disaster and resources are brought to bear. And that's great, and we should continue to do that. What we shouldn't do is forget that low-wealth communities, and particularly low-wealth communities of color in this country, are affected in deeper and more prolonged ways than other communities.
At least a quarter of our country will never be prepared for a disaster. So we really have to rethink what preparedness looks like. And a study where we looked at the aftermath of Hurricane Matthew as well as Harvey, we had educators talking about months of their students still having traumatic experiences anytime it rained outside. If we're not honest about the fact that if you are from a low-income community, if you're a community of color, your chances of recovering from a disaster are much smaller just based on those facts alone. And without being very honest about that, we then are not able to really talk about what a just recovery looks like.
Besides the Road Home grants, our community needs major infrastructure repairs, basic city services, hospitals, grocery stores, and everything that goes with the quality of life we had before Katrina. My community had 2 hospitals before Katrina, and as of this date, we have none.
FEMA has renewed the deadlines for public assistance projects and relief funds tied to Hurricane Katrina multiple times, but those ongoing federal relief efforts are expected to end for good in 2025.
This is a major American city. These people were working class American citizens who had a terrible thing happen to them. Months, and in the case of the Lower Ninth Ward, years and years and years later, we're still struggling to get back on our feet and to get people back into their homes.
Many of the people who want to come home still to this day never had enough dollars to rebuild. So even though the time is up on the federal dollars, there's still streets and sewer and infrastructure that need to be put in place so communities like the Lower Ninth Ward can live with dignity and live with integrity and live with, a sense of community.
We're 20 years out. By the books, we would think that people have recovered and moved on, but that's not the case. You can still see that there are places that still have boards up on them. What does recovery mean for that person who may feel like administration is telling them that they have to move, but they have 5 generations of folks who are buried in that ground?
Many of the homes in the Ninth Ward were paid off, passed down through generations. This meant freedom from mortgages, but it also meant many residents didn't have homeowners or flood insurance, leaving them without a safety net. Trying to apply for assistance after the storm meant accessing ruined homes to search for titles and deeds. Many families had limited digital records. Verifying ownership was a complicated and often insurmountable task. What does recovery look like when your home and your history are underwater?
My name is Walter Thomas, a.k.a. Tommy T. I reside at 2201 Flood Street, the Lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans, Louisiana. My house was approximately 24 feet underwater. Since then, my house has been demolished. I'm currently residing in a FEMA handicap trailer. I applied for the road home. I called 30 to 40 times. Every time I called, I get the same answer. Someone will get back to you. It never happened. I gave up. I put it in God's hand. I know we're a great city. We will survive.
It's a catchy kind of narrative that we as Americans, we really like the thought that something terrible has happened, but then there is a good kind of happy ending. Saying that someone is resilient, you ignore the fact that they had limited access to supplies, they had limited access to support before the event. Resiliency glosses over the harms that disadvantaged communities face. At some point, I remember our community members were very clear. They said, I don't want to be resilient anymore. I just want to have a strong infrastructure to live in the community that my great-great-grandparents had lived in. And so the fear is sometimes giving this a happy ending is often more harmful than just identifying the issues, creating solutions, and creating a new ending that is a just ending for all.